So the way that this argument came to me was because I was talking to Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins, and we were talking about morality. He's a high tier atheist philosopher, and he believes that you cannot get morality without rationality. And he told me that reality is rational. He said literally, reality equals rationality. And I thought that that seemed really strange because I said, Ben, doesn't rationality require a mind? And he said, no, it doesn't, obviously, because I'm an atheist. And I said, well, normally rationality requires a mind. And he had just finished explaining to me earlier in the conversation the difference between non rationality and irrationality. He had explained to me that to be non rational is to not be able to aim towards reason. So things like rocks or maybe a baby crying, these things are non rational. Whereas to be irrational is to be aware of rationality, to be aware of reason, and to be deviating away from it, either by accident or on purpose or just neglect. But you have to be aware rationality in the first place in order to be irrational. And so once Ben said that reality is rational, I said, well, Ben, if it requires a mind to be irrational, then it has to require a mind to be rational because that's the whole thing about being irrational. It requires a mind. And you're talking about rationality, which is, basically the fulfillment of being irrational. So if it requires a mind to be irrational, it has to require a mind to be rational. It's got to,
Mhm.
because it's the same standard. So if you have to have a mind to be irrational, you have to have a mind to be rational. And so that really got me thinking, if you have to have a mind to be rational and we have rationality, then that means rationality requires a mind.
Before we get into the syllogism, so if I was thinking, if I was an atheist, where I would start in trying to dismantle this argument or this argument for rationality is I would say that rationality is evolved. So it's rationality is simply a product of evolution, since the human mind and everything that exists is material. Again, from a naturalist perspective, if everything that exists is material, the human mind and body all evolved. Therefore, the byproduct of human evolution is the human mind, and therefore, whenever we're using the human mind in ways that line up with reality, that's kind of like what we're talking about whenever we're talking about rationality. So, why would
Yeah.
evolution maybe not be a good explanation for the existence of rationality?
Well, it seems like a really good objection on its face, but I think in order for your audience to understand why it isn't, I need to go through the argument first and then come
Okay.
back to, because if I just try to explain the problem with it, I'm pretty much going to have to explain the entire argument anyway. So,
Yeah, no, that's fair. Well, go through the argument then as best you can here. I know you've written about it extensively.
mhm. Yeah, okay. And if I am not clear on anything, just try to listen to it with fresh ears if you can. And if I'm not clear on anything, or if I don't define something that you think needs to be defined or whatever, just go ahead and stop me. And hopefully we can get all of that cleared up. I'd like for this to be communicated as clearly as possible. So, all
Yeah.
right.
I'll pretend I've not read the argument. I haven't heard it yet. What is the
Yeah,
rational argument for the existence of God?
awesome. So the argument goes like this. If the property of rationality exists, then God must exist. Rationality, or the property of rationality, exists, therefore God must exist. Okay, so it's pretty simple syllogism, and before I really start to explain the argument, I want to explain what transcendental reasoning is, because this is ultimately a transcendental argument. And a lot of people don't understand transcendental reasoning at all. And that's because it's difficult to wrap your mind around. And it's also because most people are terrible at explaining transcendental reasoning,
Hmm.
but I've given it a lot of thought, and I think I can explain it very simply. So, when we're doing transcendental reasoning, what we're doing is we're asking ourselves, what must be the case in order for the thing that we observe to be the case? Okay. So, let's think about an engine, for example, or a car, right? If we know how a car works, we know that in order for the engine to turn on, it must be the case that the starter is working. Okay.
Hmm.
So then from that, it follows if we get into our vehicle and we turn the key and the engine turns on, it necessarily follows that we have a working starter. At least it worked that time. Maybe the next time it won't. But the way that you could formulate this argument is you could say, if my engine turns on, then my starter works. My engine has turned on, therefore my starter works. Or you could say, another way of putting that would be to say, a necessary precondition for the possibility of my engine turning on is for me to have a working starter. My engine has turned on, therefore I have a working starter. Okay.
Follow that.
Um, yeah, it's pretty simple, right?
Mhm.
Now, if we think about this when it comes to arguments that have to do with transcendentals, like for God, what we're really doing is we're looking at possible worlds, okay? And we're saying, what kind of world must we be in order to get the stuff that we see in our world, okay? So, for example, imagine if there's a world with no space, okay? Like it's a space.
I don't know if I have the mental capacity to imagine that type of world, but I'll grant the premise.
It's like a one-dimensional
Mhm.
world,
Okay,
right?
fair enough. Okay, I can conceive of a one-dimensional world. Okay, I got you.
Hmm. Right. So, in a one-dimensional world, could electricity exist?
I don't think so.
Right. And that's because electrons need space in order to move, right? So if you don't have any space to move, from one electron to the other, or from one atom to the other, I should say, then, right? Because electricity is the movement of electrons from one atom to the other. So you could say that a necessary precondition for the of electricity is a world where space exists, right? So, and then you say, okay, electricity exists in my world, so therefore my world must have the dimension of space, something like that.
Okay, yeah, I follow you there.
So, yeah, so that means that any world that doesn't have space as part of its metaphysic, right, as part of its reality, cannot generate electricity by definition.
Okay, no, I mean all that follows. All that follows.
Yeah. So that's basically what transcendental reasoning is we're asking ourselves what must be the case in order to get this thing that we're observing. So I see electricity, it must be the case based on what electricity is that we live in a world with space because of what electricity is. Okay?
Well,
So
thank you
now,
for a better education on transcendental truths because I definitely think about transcendental truths, and we think about transcendental truths whenever we think about the moral argument or something of that nature. But
yeah.
that's a brilliant expression of it. So no, it's good.
Well, I've been thinking about this for years, and it always bugs me how poorly it's articulated by most apologists. So I try to explain it very simply so that people can get it, because once you get it, it's very powerful. But it's just really difficult to explain it simply, apparently. I don't know. Hopefully, I've done a good job of it today, but
So you've
um,
established transcendental truths, and
mhm.
transcendental truths do then exist. I would suppose then, even from a naturalist perspective, based off what you've provided for transcendental truths, a naturalist could agree then with the existence of transcendental truths in your example of um, electricity and it needing a world with space in order for it to exist. So, how does that all tie back into your rational argument for the existence of God and why naturalism then could not explain properly or be sufficient properly um, for rationality to exist.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of unpacking that I'm going to have to do here.
I
So
know there is.
yeah. So the first thing that I feel I should probably point out is this dichotomy between atheism and theism. And maybe I shouldn't say theism, maybe that's not exactly correct, but what I mean is either God or not God. Because theism is a personal God, and you could have an impersonal God, like a deistic sort of God. So maybe I shouldn't say atheism versus theism, but the dichotomy is either there's a God or there's no God. All right. That's a true dichotomy. And when we talk about what God is a mind. If God is anything, God is a mind,
Mhm.
right? Because if there's no mind fundamentally that's responsible for our world or our reality, then atheism is true. Full stop, in my view. I don't know how you can say that there's no mind responsible for everything and atheism be false. It's got to be a mind. So
Always.
ultimately, yeah, ultimately, when we talk about God, we're talking about a mind. And a lot of people don't put it that way, but that's the only real way to put it, right? In my
Mhm.
view, I think it's just totally obvious. Because otherwise, what the heck are we even talking about when we talk about God? It's got to be a mind. It's anything.
We're talking about a weird man in the sky, a fictitious sky daddy, right? Who just
Still a mind.
sits up there and judges us. No, I no,
Hmm.
I agree. I think that atheists do often underestimate what the potential intelligence of an entity must be that created the laws which govern the universe, or that designed DNA or any of the
Yeah.
complexities of life.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the design argument, it's saying there's a mind that has designed our world, right? That's why the design argument is an argument for God, because to design something is to do something with intentionality. So if you're designing something that requires a mind, all of the arguments for God are ultimately tapping into what we know about what minds do and saying minds do this thing, and the thing that we're observing in the world seems like it should come from a mind, so we should think that our world comes from a mind versus naturalism, which would say that it comes from not mind. If you actually pay attention to all the arguments for God, they're ultimately tapping into that idea that the world comes from a mind.
Mhm.
So,
Um, to which a naturalist might object that all of those arguments are God of the gaps arguments, right? They might
sure,
object that
but that's
just
not my
because
point.
we don't understand how something can exist without a mind, that doesn't then therefore then follow that it came from a mind. You could either respond to that,
Yeah.
or if you want to kind of unpack some of your premises a little bit more
Hmm.
deeply, because I know that you unpack them extensively in writing. So your choice on which direction to take it from here.
Right now, that these arguments for God prove God. I'm just pointing out that all these arguments are saying that there's a mind that's responsible for everything. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about God, is we are saying that there is a mind responsible for everything. That's what we're saying. And so either it's mind that's responsible for everything or it's not mind.